Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. In this article, the writer examines whether India's controversial anti-terror laws have led the country towards an era of over-criminalization. See, the criminal justice system of any country is an instrument of the state available to deal with crimes, and the way in which it is used indicates the state of democracy in that country. Popular French jurist Montesquieu had stated that every punishment which does not arise from absolute necessity is tyrannical. It essentially meant that criminal law and criminal justice system should be used only as a last resort or as the ultima ratio in order to deal with the most reprehensible of crimes and wrongs. So this philosophy and line of thinking means that criminal justice system in a democracy should be narrow and not wide in order to ensure that the criminal justice system is not misused to stifle democratic rights. But unfortunately, in many democracies, including in India, criminal law has become a symbol of power in the hands of the government instead of emerging as a symbol of justice. The writer expresses concern that in the Indian context, ordinary crimes which can be punished or which can be dealt with under ordinary criminal laws are being deliberately dealt under anti terrorism laws by classifying criminal acts as acts of terrorism. These questions are being raised by the author in the context of the latest ruling of the Delhi High Court, which we discussed recently on the 16th of June. Because in this ruling, the Delhi High Court ordered the release of three student activists who had been denied bail as they were charged under anti terrorism laws for protesting against the government and the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act. We have seen a disturbing trend where civil society activists, students, intellectuals, and protesters who are opposing government policies and laws, who are protesting against the state, are being increasingly charged under anti terror laws such as the UAPA or the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. This leads the writer to question whether every criminal should be treated as a terrorist. Is every violent crime an act of terrorism? Did the parliament enact India's anti terror laws to punish ordinary criminals and ordinary crimes? See, the anti terror laws that have been brought out in India till date include the TADA or the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, and POTA, Prevention of Terrorism Act, and the NSA, the National Security Act, and the main anti terror law, that is the UAPA or the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Out of these four laws, currently only two of them remain in our law books, and TADA and POTA are no longer a part of the criminal justice system. TADA was introduced in 1985 primarily to deal with Khalistan insurgency and terrorism in the state of Punjab. It was even amended in 1987. But because of a sunset clause or a sunset provision which allowed for the law to lapse after a certain deadline, and due to major controversies surrounding its misuse, the law was allowed to lapse in 1995. To understand the controversy surrounding it and to understand the extent of its misuse, one needs to look at the conviction rate under TADA. The writer points out that until 1994, under TADA, 67,000 cases were registered. And shockingly, out of them, conviction was achieved only in 725 cases. That too because confessions made to police officers had been made admissible as evidence under the TADA. This extremely low conviction rate clearly shows that in most of the cases, charges were being invoked on very flimsy grounds, and any criminal act and even ordinary crimes were being charged under the terrorism laws of TADA, and even any act of opposition against the government, any act of protest or expressing dissent against the government was inviting charges under TADA. Then after TADA lapsed, POTA was introduced as India's primary legal weapon against terrorism. POTA also met the same fate as TADA. It became highly controversial as a result of its frequent misuse and abuse, which directly contributed to the violation of human rights and fundamental rights. Eventually, POTA was repealed in 2004, And there are several instances that have been documented where non-terror related offences and even innocents have been charged under the POTA. Then we have the National Security Act of 1980, which provides for a very wide and vague definition of threats to countries' national security and allows the police and law enforcement agencies to interpret various acts that could threaten the country's national security. And this wide discretion provided to the authorities has often led to its misuse and abuse, thereby resulting in the over criminalization of India's criminal justice system. To justify this argument, all we have to do is to look at Allahabad High Court's recent ruling, where it had to quash 94 out of 120 cases that had been filed under the National Security Act. This clearly shows that the cases that were filed by the police did not stand up in the court of law, and the High Court determined very quickly that these cases were filed on flimsy charges, and most of them were a result of the misuse of discretionary powers in an attempt to stifle dissent and opposition in the name of fighting terrorism and national security threats. Then comes India's primary legal weapon against terrorism, the UAPA, which is constantly in news. And while such a law is essential to fight terror, and while it contains several provisions that helps India effectively fight against terrorism, it does contain several controversial provisions as well, which has resulted in its misuse and wrongful application. The latest ruling of the Delhi High Court in the Asif Iqbal Thana case, where the three student activists were granted bail, points to the frequent misuse of UAPA. The writer says that between 2015 and 2019, 7,840 persons were charged and arrested under the UAPA. Shockingly, out of this, just around 155 were convicted in trial courts, and upon appeal to higher judiciary, that is the High Courts and the Supreme Court, many of them were even entirely acquitted by the higher judiciary. This extremely low conviction rate again shows how these laws are often misused by the police and law enforcement and by the governments, which is leading to the weakening of democratic and fundamental rights and a subsequent erosion of the ideal of justice. According to the writer, the biggest shortcoming in India's anti-terror laws is that they lack a precise definition of terrorism. In fact, even at the global level, there is no consensus on the definition of terrorism, and globally, there are hundreds of different definitions of terrorism, and we do not have a universal definition of terrorism. Even the United Nations has struggled to define terrorism for years together, and still there has been no consensus. As experts say, terrorism and its definition is very subjective, and as the popular phrase goes, one man's terrorist is another man's revolutionary. This subjectiveness in the nature of terrorism, the place, the time, and the overall context in which it occurs has led to several different versions of definition of terrorism. And as a result, we do not have consensus even at the global level with regard to the definition of terrorism. In India, our anti-terror laws provide for an extremely vague and wide definition, whereas the basic principle in criminal law is that criminal laws should be as narrow and precise as possible in order to prevent its misuse and abuse. For example, just look at Section 15 of the UAPA. It merely defines a terrorist act in extremely wide and vague words as any act with intent to threaten or likely to threaten the unity, integrity, security, or sovereignty of India, or with intent to strike terror or likely to strike terror in the people. Then, with regard to how such terror acts could be committed, the UAPA says that such terror acts will be committed by using bombs, dynamite, or other explosive substances, or inflammable substances, or firearms, or other lethal weapons, or poisonous or noxious gases, or by any other means of whatever nature to cause or likely to cause death or injuries. While this provision has specific references to the ways in which acts of terrorism could be carried out, it does provide for a very vague and wide definition in the end by including the word by any other means. Generally, legal jurisprudence is that if a provision contains a mix of general and specific words, then priority is always given to specific words. Such laws should be interpreted in the context of specific words only, with least priority being given to the generic words. But however, in India, with regard to the application of UAPA, the general words have been given priority over the specific words that have been used in the law, thereby making these provisions extremely vague and wide, which gives discretion to the police and the law enforcement to define the other means of terrorism and to extend the definition of terrorism itself. So, even a democratic act of protesting against the government could be labeled as a terrorist activity and they could be charged under these stringent provisions. The writer explores various court rulings to point out as to why this is a blatant over-criminalization of India's criminal justice system. He refers to the Kartar Singh case of 1994, in which the Supreme Court had observed that anti-terror laws are being deliberately misused to deny bail to the accused. In the same case, the judiciary also observed that disturbance of public order does not amount to an act of terrorism. The Supreme Court clearly drew a distinction between disturbance to public order and acts of terrorism. Then, in the Yaqub Memon case of 2013, the Supreme Court defined a range of terrorist activities. It included actual assassinations, kidnappings, hijacking of aircraft, car bombs, explosions, mailing of dangerous material, usage of chemical, biological, nuclear weapons, etc. Only such grave acts were to be treated as acts of terrorism and clearly does not include disturbance to law and order and public order, and it definitely does not include protests and dissent against the government. Then in the Hitendra Vishnu Thakur case of 1994 as well, the Supreme Court tried to bring out more clarity with regard to the definition of terrorism. The Supreme Court defined terrorism as the use of violence when its most important result is not merely the physical and mental damage of the victim, but the prolonged psychological effect it produces on the society as a whole. The Supreme Court stated that the main objective of such acts would be to overawe the government or to disturb the harmony of the society or to terrorize people. So clearly, as per this ruling, what distinguishes terrorism from other forms of violence is the deliberate and systematic usage of coercive intimidation. And coercive intimidation occurs when these grave acts of violence are committed which overawes the government. Again, it clearly does not include just mere disturbances of law and order and public order, and it definitely does not cover protest and the act of expressing dissent against the government. Then in the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case, the Supreme Court went one step ahead and observed that those involved in the suicide bombing of Rajiv Gandhi, that is the accused, they did not have the intent to overawe the government or to strike terror amongst people, and hence the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi should not be held as a terrorist activity under TADA. But the most important ruling in this regard comes from the Ram Manohar Lohia case of 1966. In this ruling, the court clearly drew a distinction between law and order, public order, and security of the state. The Supreme Court had ruled in this case that law and order represents the largest circle or the universal set within which the next smaller circle appears that represents public order, and the smallest circle represents the security of the state. So accordingly, a particular act may affect law and order but not public order. Similarly, an act might affect and disrupt public order, but it may not affect the security of the state. So such a clear distinction was drawn between law and order, public order, and security of the state by the Supreme Court. But unfortunately, our police and law enforcement agencies are deliberately failing to understand and realize these distinctions. And through blatant application of these laws, even to charge ordinary crimes, and by branding them as acts of terrorism, the state of democracy in India is being weakened. Then in the historic PUCL judgment of 2003, in which the Supreme Court was examining the constitutionality of POTA, the court highlighted that one of the key aspects of terrorism is that these acts are designed to raise constitutional principles that we hold dear and to tear apart the secular fabric of the country and to promote prejudice and bigotry. So clearly, protests and disruption to law and order and public order do not fall under this definition. Then, in the A.K. Roy case of 1982, the court brought out the misuse of provisions of the National Security Act while examining its constitutionality. In this case, the Supreme Court had observed that while construing preventive detention laws such as the National Security Act, care must be taken to restrict their application to as few situations as possible. Then, in the Sanjay Dutt case of 1994 as well, the Supreme Court held that those whom the law did not intend to punish are not to be roped in by expanding or stretching the penal provisions. So, this makes it very clear that the latest judgment of the Delhi High Court comes at the right time, because in this ruling, the Delhi High Court not only brought out the misuse of UAPA, but it also made an attempt to provide for a clear definition of what constitutes terrorism. Now let's take up another column from page number 6, in which the writers examine the usage of torture as an investigative tool by security agencies around the world. See, in many countries, security forces, including intelligence agencies, police forces, and the military, they often believe that torture, either physical torture or psychological torture, is an essential and justified investigative technique to extract information and evidence from the accused, even at the cost of breaching ethical, moral, and constitutional norms. So, since torture has been normalized in security forces around the world, the writers examine whether the implementation of the Mendes principles help in achieving a torture-free world. They even examine the prevalence of torture in India and whether the Mendes principles are applicable in the Indian context. See, the Mendes principles against torture has been developed through careful research and scientific and empirical studies, which were led by Juan E. Mendes, a popular Argentinian lawyer and as well as a former UN Special Rapporteur on torture. Back in the 1970s, Mendes himself was a victim of torture that was committed against him by the Argentinian security forces and the military junta. As a leading global figure and a political activist against torture, he has helped develop the Mendes principles, which seeks to replace torture and coercive investigation techniques with rapport-based interviews. The Mendes principles seek to reinforce and establish a paradigm shift in investigation and interrogation by entirely replacing torture and coercive techniques with rapport-based interviews. To ensure this, the principles provide for legal and procedural safeguards, along with practical and enforceable guidelines that can help promote non-coercive interrogation techniques. It also contains measures to protect the accused while in custody, because those who are in custody, they face heightened vulnerabilities and they would be at the increased risk of facing torture, and they also face the risk of being subjected to fear and threats by the authorities who are eager to solve the cases by extracting information from the accused. The Mendes Principles also contains a set of guidelines to provide sensitized training to police and security forces and also to hold them accountable in case of violations and breaches, along with practical provisions for its effective implementation. See, there are enough scientific and empirical studies that have been conducted which have clearly established that the usage of torture and coercion as an interrogation technique is clearly counterproductive. Studies conducted across disciplines, including psychology, criminology, sociology, and neuroscience, they have clearly established that when an individual is placed under stress positions or when they are tortured with extreme techniques like waterboarding, it causes significant damage to their memory and to their ability to recollect information. The trauma faced during torture affects the memory of the individual, and as a result, whatever they confess or whatever information they provide may not be entirely accurate. Also, when an individual is faced with aggressive questioning and threats and coercive interrogation, it's natural human behavior to get resistant and to say anything or give away any information just to escape the threat of violence. And in many cases, the information provided would be unreliable and they could also be entirely false confessions. These studies have clearly proven that there exists scientific evidence to reject the widely held misconception that a certain degree of pressure and torture is essential to yield accurate information and evidence. So that is the reason why the Mendes Principles is trying to move away investigation from torture and coercive interrogation towards rapport-based interviews. This will not only help make investigation more effective by collecting accurate information and evidence, but it will also help in preventing the violation of human rights and fundamental rights of the accused. In the case of India, torture is seen to be widely prevalent among security forces. And according to the writers, in many ways, torture has become institutionalized, and indirectly, the law itself accommodates torture and coercive interrogation. The National Human Rights Commission itself has pointed out that torture in India has become normalized amongst our police and security forces. And a recent survey conducted in 2019, which involved around 12,000 police personnel, clearly brought out the widespread belief within police forces that torture is necessary and essential and justified to extract information and evidence from the accused. The survey revealed that 3 out of 4 police personnel felt that it is justified for the police to be violent towards criminals. Then 4 out of 5 police personnel felt that there is nothing wrong in the police beating up criminals to extract confessions. So in India, the usage of coercion, the usage of threats and intimidation, and the actual resort to violence is extremely common within our security and police forces, and more or less torture has been normalized in our legal criminal system. The writers point out that there are several structural constraints that fuel the persistence of torture in India. In India, the investigators are overburdened due to the shortage of trained professionals who specialize in interrogation techniques. Plus, the police and security forces face a shortage of adequate resources, and they also face tremendous pressure from the political class and as well as from the media and the public to crack cases as soon as possible. So this accompanied with the image of a vigilante cop, which is over glorified by our popular media and which is accepted and celebrated by the public and by the political class, has ended up openly encouraging and tolerating torture in our legal and criminal system. Take, for example, how the media, the public, and the political class celebrated the encounters in Hyderabad following the Disha gang rape incident of 2019. From the common public itself, and as well as from certain sections of the media, there is a tacit approval to engage in torture against the accused. And all these structural constraints are affecting our investigative techniques. And in many indirect ways, they're actually promoting torture as an effective and justified tool in interrogation. Then, more shockingly, there is an indirect backdoor in our legal system that provides for the accommodation of torture in interrogation. See, under our criminal laws, confessions made before a police officer, they are not admissible evidence in a court of law. This provision has been provided to ensure that police do not resort to torture, and hence confession provided by the accused in front of the police officer is not admitted as a piece of evidence in a court of law. But however, if you look at Section 27 of the Indian Evidence Act, it creates an indirect route which actually encourages torture and creates an incentive for the investigator to rely upon torture. This section permits the admissibility of statements before the police to the extent that they relate to the recovery of material evidence or material objects, which is known as recovery evidence, based on confessions provided by the accused. Basically, if the confession of an accused results in the recovery of any evidence or in the recovery of any material objects, then that recovery evidence is admissible in a court of law, because as per Section 27 of the Indian Evidence Act, the confession of the accused correlates and corroborates with the recovery evidence. So even though the law does not recognize confession as an admissible piece of evidence, this provision of the Indian Evidence Act provides for recognition of recovery evidence which is based on confessions made by the accused. So this creates an incentive and an indirect route or a backdoor for the investigator to somehow extract a confession from the accused which will result in the recovery of material objects or evidence. Or in some cases, the security forces and the investigators, they might even plant the evidence and extract such confessions which can be corroborated and correlated with recovery evidence and with the material objects recovered. Then such evidence becomes admissible in a court of law. In fact, this institutionalization of torture in India has been acknowledged by the Indian judiciary itself, including former top judges of the Supreme Court. Several former Supreme Court judges have acknowledged that there is a heightened risk of torture as a shortcut method in order to extract such recovery evidence. Many former judges have acknowledged another major flaw in Indian criminal law because there is no legal provision that prohibits or bars tainted evidence that has been collected through torture. In certain countries, these provisions exist. In such criminal legal systems, if evidence is obtained through torture, and even if the evidence is valid, and even if it establishes the guilt of the accused, such tainted evidence is not accepted in a court of law. But in India, we do not have any legal provisions that prohibits or bars tainted evidence which has been obtained through torture. This matter has been left to the individual discretion of the judges to decide whether such evidence should be accepted or not. So in short, the writers are of the opinion that torture is widely prevalent in India and it has been encouraged and nurtured and even institutionalized through various factors. And until this culture changes, it won't be an appropriate time for the introduction of Mendes principles in India. And hence the writers conclude by saying that Mendes's anti-torture vision is still distant for India. Now let's look at an editorial from page number 6, which examines the Draft Cinematograph Amendment Bill 2021, which has been brought out by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which seeks to amend the Cinematograph Act of 1952. The objective of this act is to regulate and certify cinema content, that is movies, through a statutory body established under the law, known as the CBFC or the Central Board of Film Certification, which operates under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. The functioning of this board and its decisions related to certification of movies has always led to a debate over the need to protect the fundamental rights guaranteed under Article 19 from censorship of the government and the need to impose reasonable restrictions on these fundamental rights guaranteed under Article 19 in the larger interests of the nation. See, Article 19 provides for freedom of speech and expression, including the right to dissent against the government. But these fundamental rights under Article 19, they come with a set of reasonable restrictions on the grounds of unity and sovereignty of the nation, disruption to public order, disruption to friendly relations with foreign governments, etc. On these grounds of reasonable restrictions, freedom of speech and expression and the right to dissent can be curbed, and such decisions often raise the question of censorship. See, it's a well-known fact that authoritative governments always seek to censor movies, be it the repressive regime in Iran or be it the emergency era government in India. They have always sought to curb freedom of speech and expression and the right to dissent by censoring movies and other content. Such censorship continues even in functional democracies like India, and by evaluating the draft rules, the editorial is of the opinion that new layers of censorship are being added through these amendments, which poses a threat to the existing space for public discourse and public debate. Because see, through these draft provisions, which has been brought out into the public domain for receiving feedback, it becomes evident that the government is looking to acquire more powers to itself to regulate and certify movies henceforth. The amendment that has been proposed introduces a provision which gives the government the powers to recertify a film which has already been certified by the CBFC. Upon this, in April, the government brought out an ordinance through which the Film Certification Appellate Tribunal, which was also a statutory body under the law, has been scrapped. This tribunal had been set up under the law to receive appeals and complaints against the decisions of the CBFC. It provided an opportunity for filmmakers to appeal against the decisions of the CBFC. But this course of appeal has been taken away by the government through this latest ordinance. And along with that, If the government is going to give itself the powers to recertify a film which has already been certified by the CBFC, then it will most likely result in the censorship of movies, thereby resulting in a direct erosion of the fundamental right to free speech and expression and right to dissent that has been guaranteed under Article 19 of the Constitution. The editorial points out that these draft provisions they are in violation of the Supreme Court's judgment that was delivered in the K.M. Shankarappa case of 2000. In this case, the Supreme Court had made it clear that the union government cannot acquire revisional powers to itself against films which have already been certified by the CBFC. So, this draft provision proposed through the amendment is clearly in violation of the Supreme Court judgment, and the draft provisions acknowledge this judgment of the Supreme Court. But the government has stated that this provision is essential in order to protect the unity and the sovereignty of the nation, which has been listed as a reasonable restriction under Article 19, Clause 2, which allows for curbing freedom of speech and expression and the right to dissent. Through this proposed amendment, the government is looking to acquire powers to itself, through which it can direct the chairman of the board to review a film which has already been certified if it is found to be violative of the provisions contained under Article 19. Along with this attempt to regulate movies, recently the government brought out a set of controversial IT rules which also seeks to regulate OTT platforms. And according to the editorial, these new rules and laws in combination, they will lead to the stifling of creative freedom, freedom of expression and democratic dissent in the country. Now let's look at this article from page number 12. India's Petroleum and Natural Gas Minister Dharmendra Pradhan has reminded the OPEC, which is a grouping of oil exporting countries, to moderate the rising oil prices during its upcoming meeting, or else the rising oil prices will push India to explore alternative import sources such as Iran. India has reminded the OPEC that rising oil prices has already strained its economy, and this had forced India to tap into its strategic petroleum reserves, which has already been exhausted. Now, with retail petrol and diesel prices shooting up, along with the rising import bill of the government, India would be forced to look at alternative sources of supply such as Iran if the OPEC group of countries fail to bring down the oil prices. See, at one point, Iran was the second largest supplier of crude oil to India. But today, India doesn't import any oil from Iran because India fell under American pressure, which had imposed economic sanctions against Iran. Under the pressure exerted by the then Donald Trump government, the Modi government in India zeroed out oil imports from Iran. But now, India is looking to restart supplies from Iran by trying to work with US for the lifting of these economic sanctions, as the current high global oil prices are significantly hurting the Indian economy. Now let's look at another article from page number 12. Sri Lanka is banking on $1 billion currency swap deal with India to help fulfill its debt obligations. See, of late the Sri Lankan economy has run into serious trouble, and Sri Lanka has fallen under a major debt burden as it owes billions of dollars to foreign governments and financial institutions. In order to overcome this debt crisis, Sri Lanka has been entering into currency swap arrangements with friendly countries and with regional organizations. And currently it is expecting a $1 billion currency swap deal to materialize with India. See, a currency swap agreement between two countries is an agreement or a contract to exchange their respective currencies with predetermined terms and conditions. The central banks and governments of those countries, they engage in currency swaps with their foreign counterparts to meet short-term foreign exchange liquidity requirements or to ensure adequate foreign currency to avoid BOP crisis or balance of payments crisis till longer arrangements can be made. Sri Lanka has already entered into such currency swap agreements with China and as well as with Bangladesh, and it has received a standby support of around $1.5 billion from China and another $250 million from Bangladesh. Then under the SAARC regional grouping, there is a currency swap facility that has been set up by the Reserve Bank of India. The RBI has established a corpus of $2 billion to provide for a currency swap to friendly countries in South Asia to help them overcome such foreign exchange crisis or a BOP crisis. Under this SARC facility, Sri Lanka is expected to receive $400 million from the Reserve Bank of India. But upon this, Sri Lanka would require another support of $1 billion in currency swap from India, and hence, from several months, Sri Lanka has been seeking India's assistance in this regard. This assistance is going to be crucial to help Sri Lanka meet its debt obligations, and the Indian leadership has been considering this request. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: anti-terror laws in the country have led to an era of over-criminalization. Do you agree? Justify. The second question: evaluate India's progress in eradicating torture from its criminal system. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.